Welcome to lecture number 5, Qualitative Research, Strategies and Methods. This is the first part of Qualitative Research lecture. Next week, we will continue with the second part of this lecture. What is qualitative research? We will understand what qualitative research is about not only through part 1 and part 2 of this lecture, but also when we will start studying quantitative research, and then we will be able to compare and contrast between qualitative and quantitative research. Qualitative researchers have 4 main concerns related to people, context, process, and the structure of the research. By people, we mean that qualitative researchers are interested in studying how people construct and understand their own social meanings. By context, we mean that qualitative researchers are interested in describing in great detail the context of the social setting and create what we call thick descriptions of this context. Qualitative research has a strong emphasis on process. This means that qualitative researchers try to capture life in terms of processes that go through a multitude of changes. To understand and capture how change takes place in everyday life, that requires from the researchers to observe the social setting, generally for long periods of time. And the fourth concern of qualitative researchers relates to the structure or the research design itself. Generally, qualitative researchers will prefer to keep the design to a minimum so as to permit for the field itself and the subjects in the field to help shaping the design in case this is needed. So, in terms of the methods that qualitative researchers adopt, though they start with a given design, these may change during the research while being in the field because of what they reveal. What is, in fact, qualitative? By qualitative in qualitative research, we refer to the quality of something, to its characteristics and attributes. By something, obviously, we mean the social setting that we are studying. So, in understanding, in studying the characteristics and attributes of a social setting, we need to take into account, as we said before, the context, the social, historical, and political context of that social setting. We need to try and understand how the people inhabiting the social setting understand the characteristics and attributes of their own environment and how they interpret these characteristics and attributes, how change takes place in processes in this social setting. And in order to do so, we have to have a research design that it's limited in its structure, that it's flexible and capable of adapting to the circumstances of the study itself as it proceeds. Let us look into some other features of qualitative research. Qualitative research is mainly inductive in the sense of how it establishes the relationship between the research itself and theory. This means that generally we try to surface theories and new statements and understandings from data that we collect and analyze. However, in qualitative research, we also go about the relationship between theory and research deductively, which means that theories that exist are being tested. From the point of view of epistemology, qualitative research is generally interpretivist, which means that we try to portray the social setting that we study mainly through the eyes of the people inhabiting the social setting. Qualitative research generally adopt a constructionist ontology, which means that social phenomena is constructed by social actors rather than being a given to them. Qualitative research has a strong emphasis on words, text, rather than on numbers as in quantitative research. And as we hope we already understand, qualitative research adopts a diversity of approaches rather than being very strict in the sense of how it builds the research design. I have referred so far to qualitative research as a strategy, pointing out its main features. But there are also qualitative research methods and ways of analysis. In this lecture, we are going to focus on ethnography and participant observation. And in the next lecture, we will focus on qualitative interviewing and focus groups, though we will be mentioning also other methods. Before we start discussing ethnography and participant observation, there is an important question of criteria, evaluative criteria, to know whether or not our research design is sound and solid. There are two general evaluative criteria, both for qualitative and quantitative research designs, which are reliability and validity, and then we will discuss four criteria that are generally applied to qualitative research design. Reliability asks the question to what extent can the research be repeated. So we are asking in regards the degree to which a method or a technique produces stable and consistent results. For instance, let's take the example of a watch that runs correctly but is always 3 minutes fast. This watch is very reliable. There are different procedures to test reliability, like using a method and then again test retest, or administering different versions of the same tool or method, or administering the same version of the method to different groups. In all these procedures, again, what we are trying to test is whether or not the method that we are using is producing reliable results, consistent results. While reliability refers to how consistent are the results of a same method, validity refers to how well a method or a test is measuring what it is supposed to measure. So what validity does is to test accuracy of the method used. Let's look into different examples. A watch that tells the right time always has high validity, but a watch that runs correctly but is always 3 minutes fast is not a valid method. We can also ask the question, is procedural democracy a valid measure of democracy? In other words, for instance, the fact that a regime has elections for office, is that a valid measure of democracy? In addition to the general evaluative criteria of reliability and validity, in qualitative research, we also use as criteria credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So let's look into these 4 items now. We explained in this lecture that one of the main purposes of qualitative research is to describe and understand the whatever phenomena of interest that we are studying from the viewpoints of the participants, that is, from the perspective of the inhabitants of the social setting that we are studying. Therefore, credibility is about asking the question if the results that we are producing in our research are credible, believable, from the perspective of the participants in the research. One of our inclinations as researchers is to try to use the method or the design that we use in our case study and transfer them into other social settings, thus creating a sort of generalized or universal method to study whatever social phenomena we just have studied. Now, it is important, indeed, to try and help the effort of transferability to be accomplished, enabling, in so doing, other researchers to use the methods that we just developed. But we need to be very careful how we do that. And one important way to create a solid transferable method is to describe in great detail the context of the research and the particularities of our design. Social settings are not static systems. As the Greek philosopher Heraclitus stated, no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he is not the same man. That is, social systems and their inhabitants change constantly. So we can actually measure the same thing twice because the social systems and their components are constantly changing. The idea of dependability, on the other hand, emphasizes the need for the researcher to account for the ever-changing context within which research takes place. Confirmability is about making sure that the outcomes of the research are the result of the experiences and ideas of the participants rather than ours as researchers. So it is not that researchers have no perspectives, point of view, or values, but we need to make sure that what we are representing in the research is mainly and mostly the experiences and ideas of the informants, of the participants. And there are a number of procedures to do so, such as detailing and explaining to the reader our points of view and how we make assumptions, detailing our methodology, and also making clear how the research moved step by step and how decisions were made in regards the design and its implementation. In that way, we help the reader seeing what the informants or participants had to inform and contribute from their own perspective to the research. There are also other kind of criteria to evaluate the research design and the research project itself. For instance, we should ask in what ways our research is relevant and significant for society. Or to phrase it otherwise, does our research help furthering social change? Or how our research empower the communities and the participants that take part in our research? I mentioned before the issue of the researcher's opinion, biases, attitudes towards the research design, and also towards the very issue that we study. Now, we need to find a balance between those positions and the outcomes of the research in terms of what represents the participants and the social setting that we are studying. So, if on the one hand, researchers are concerned with controlling or balancing their biases, they certainly should not be immobilized by them. And what researchers do generally is to reflect in the writing, in the research reports, about their own predispositions towards the research and the issue that they are studying, so to let know the reader how best the reports can be read in light of these positions and in order to understand what the study is offering in terms of the social setting and the participants in the research itself. Before we start discussing ethnography and participant observation, let me say a few words about the issue of sampling and then sampling in qualitative research. Now, what sampling is about? When we choose an issue to study and we choose a certain social setting, community, we certainly cannot study, cannot research the full extent of the inhabitants of that social setting. So what we do is generally to choose a subgroup of individuals or groups, or perhaps a subgroups of events or spaces that match the goal of the research and that can be representative in order to draw valid conclusions, and we focus the study on that subgroup of, again, individuals, groups, spaces, or events. But the question is how we make that choice, how we sample that subgroup that we are actually going to study out of a bigger group of individuals or spaces or events. This is the question of sampling. Here I will just distinguish between two forms of sampling in qualitative research: purposive sampling and snowball sampling. Purposive sampling is the sampling where we choose a certain group of people based on the relevance of the group to our research questions, such as, for instance, when we need to focus on a certain range, age, or certain locations, ethnicities, race, gender, and so on and so forth. So this is a sort of strategic sampling because we totally direct the choice of who we are going to research based directly on our research questions and the goals of the study. In snowball sampling, at times there is a problem in identifying the people that we want to research, and for that reason we start with a very small group of people who somehow we manage to identify and select for the research, and then based on those participants we try to extend our search based on them and their networks of associations, friendships, or relevance that suits our goals and our research questions. So what happens in this case in snowballing is that the very first group that we start interviewing, we will be asking them how can they help us identifying more individuals and adding them to the research. Ethnography. What is ethnography? Literally, it is about the writing, the studying of cultures, of communities. Broadly speaking, ethnographic research is a family of methodologies according to which we study communities from the perspective of the people of those communities and taking into account their context. Ethnographies are based in participation of the researcher within those social settings that they are going to study. So ethnography is a sort of immersion within the daily life of the social setting that we want to study. What is ethnography about? Ethnography was pioneered in anthropology at the beginning of the 20th century, but nowadays is a central research methodology in the humanities and the social sciences. Ethnography is any small to medium scale study of everyday life in a given social setting. As such, researchers must always first negotiate and gain access into the setting that they want to study. We will expand about gaining access soon. Ethnography involves direct contact between the researchers and the participants of the study. It is about watching what happens, listening to what is said, observing what people do, how and why. It is about immersing within the social setting that we want to study. The ethnographer uses a variety of methods to collect data: observation, participation, interviewing, and also collecting different sorts of documents. In essence, what we want to achieve in an ethnography is to understand how people in the social setting that we study reflect on life, understand life, and how they form and perform their beliefs and values. And eventually, the last step of an ethnography is to produce a very rich written account. What does it mean for the researcher to participate in the social setting that they want to study, to go into the field? There are a set of practices that are very important to learn and understand how to conduct them. To begin with, for the researcher themselves, going into the field, into another social setting, means that this is a new place, a new social space that the researcher is not familiar with. First of all, we need to understand that going into the field that we want to study, in doing that, we are disrupting the ordinary everyday activity of those people that we want to study. This also means that the researcher must learn the local rules of behavior, the habits, beliefs, and attitudes that are common to that community, and always avoid imposing our own views on that social setting. When researchers want to study a social setting that is not their own, they need to understand and take into account that in doing our research activity, we may change everyday behaviors and influence the answers and the participation of those people in that setting that we want them to help us in the research. Doing ethnography means that researchers need to be prepared to stay for long periods of time in those social settings. They need to build trust with the community, try to identify people, individuals in that community that can help them understanding better how the community live. We call them cultural guides. And let the community to help you immersing so local people can teach us how to live and understand better the local culture. These are basic premises that researchers doing ethnography need to learn, develop, and properly conduct in the field so as to be able to perform the goals of the research that were placed in terms of the research questions in the first place. Given that ethnographies are about entering a social setting, entering a sort of community, it means that we need to gain access into that social setting. That is particularly difficult when it comes to researching what we call closed settings, such as school, hospitals, corporations. So we need to find ways for us to be accepted to do the research into the community. That requires strategic planning. At times, we may use acquaintances or friends that are related or part of the social setting that we want to research to help us negotiating, accessing into that social setting. At times, we may offer in return for allowing us accessing the community to research, for instance, submitting reports that can help that social setting in some way. We should be clear and honest in regard what we want to research, what we want to study about that particular community or social setting. So, in a word, gaining access into the very place that we want to research is not self-evident and need to be negotiated with the participants or perhaps with representatives of the participants in the community that we want to study. From what we have explained so far about ethnography, I believe it is clear that we were talking about a form of open ethnography, where the researcher is clear, as sincere and open with his participants in regard the goals of the research and how it is going to be conducted. But there are also undercover forms of ethnography, and this method is particularly relevant in criminology, but also in other areas depending the research question. There are with undercover ethnographies certain advantages and disadvantages. In terms of advantages, it is obvious that in undercover ethnography we do not need to negotiate access into the social setting, since we are entering the social setting in an undercover manner. The other advantage is that since no one knows that we are researching them, then they will not change their behavior because of our presence, and there will be no need on our part to counterbalance or adjust our own research in light of the change of behavior of the participants, since there will be no change at all. But there are also disadvantages to undercover ethnography. Most clearly is that there is an inherent ethical problem about undercover ethnography. We are deceiving our participants in the sense that we are not telling them that they are being investigated, they are being researched. And we are not asking them their consent to conduct the research. There is also a practical difficulty to take notes as we observe what is going on in the social setting, since we don't want to be caught taking notes. And obviously, this also means that a researcher working undercover will always be anxious about his cover being discovered. It can be claimed that participant observation, that regular activity of the ethnographer, is a sort of oxymoron, or there is a sort of inherent contradiction in the concept itself. Because this is about a researcher that tries to behave as a regular individual while adapting to other people in the social setting that he is studying, but also at the same time trying to act as an objective observer. To participate means to get involved, to join, to be subjective, to be part of the other group. But on the other hand, to observe involves being objective, trying to create a certain distance from the subject that you are trying to study in order to allow for yourself to reflect critically on what you are doing. So this tension between participating and observing is indeed part of being an ethnographer, and it is, as we said before, at times considered as a sort of contradiction in the activity itself. The term going native refers to situation in which ethnographer that stay for a very long time immersed in a community or a social setting that they are studying, they start losing their sense of being a researcher because they start feeling too close to the subjects of the research. In those cases, they may lose their ability to actually observe, so they may be losing their ability to reflect on what they are doing. Ethnographic research is both inductive and deductive. We collect data in the field, and the reflection on that data, the analysis of the data, may lead to discoveries and to new understandings that could influence theories and correct them. But at the same time, when we enter the field to do research, we do so always with an initial set of ideas, theories, hypotheses, and questions that always derive from our prior knowledge, which are those who are examining the field, and perhaps because of our discoveries, our new understandings may be corrected. So, doing ethnography is a dual exercise that comprises both inductive and deductive ways, not only to reasoning, but also to do research. Some may think that ethnographic research looks only at the micro level of a certain social setting, but in fact, in studying some social setting, we may also be studying phenomena that is global. For instance, how climate change affects farmers' ways of life. Fieldwork with refugees who were granted asylum can explain aspects of the relation of states to the refugee phenomenon and migration flows more generally. And also, fieldwork with political activists can explain patterns of resistance in similarly oppressive societies. So, in a word, we may be studying very specific small social setting, but we also could study them by asking the big questions of the world.